it means it's got a slightly strange implication, which is that if veganism is just excluding animal suffering to the highest extent practicable, then even if you are killing an animal for food, if you're doing it in such a way that genuinely minimizes to the highest extent practicable all forms of animal suffering or exploitation, then it's not just that you're permissibly breaking veganism or something. Like you're doing the vegan thing according to the ethical definition.
Hey, what is going on, guys? So this is going to be part 2 of my response to Cosmic Skeptic going on to Michaela Peterson's podcast. If you haven't seen part 1, which primarily targets Michaela Peterson and her tendency to baselessly make claims about vegan nutrition, I highly recommend you watch that part before watching this one. Seeing as part 1 primarily targeted Michaela Peterson and her, empirical claims against the vegan diet, this part is going to primarily have to do with Cosmic Skeptic and be much more philosophical rather than empirical and, with data, etc. However, let it be made clear that this is not meant to be a kind of aggressive attack toward Cosmic Skeptic. Many of you know I've been a fan of his work for some time now. Instead, we'll be going over what seems to be his concept of morality and ethical veganism and some of the problems I have with both. So let me just be even more clear, this video is not meant to divide vegans. Videos of this nature tend to trigger some people's tribalistic instincts, so I just feel the need to really emphasize this here. I speculate this is partially because of the troll thumbnails and controversial titles I like to use, which are usually just there to make the video more clickable, plus the thumbnails are just fun to come up with. So regardless of how I formulate the thumbnail and title for this video, just know that this is just going to be a calm criticism of Alex's moral system and concept of ethical veganism. Now, before getting onto those criticisms, I do want to address some comments made in defense of Alex's more passive performance on Michaela's podcast, which I had read many times over in the comment section of my previous video. And this part of the video is not really for Alex, as I still don't know what his intentions were in being so passive on her podcast, but instead the people defending his passive performance. So the reason many people came to defend Alex's performance in my last video's comment section is because there were many people who were disappointed, including myself, with Alex's passive performance on Michaela's podcast. Michaela Peterson was making several baseless claims concerning the vegan diet being nutritionally inadequate and other claims like meat is necessary for good health. And Alex didn't really push back on much of these claims. Many people in defense of Alex's passive performance speculated that the reason he was performing this way was to kind of win over Michaela's audience and hence thought he did a good job. So let's assume it was the case that Alex was for sure acting more agreeable and passive in an effort to win over Michaela's audience. So what do people mean when they say win over? Win over in what respect? Win over in regard to his person or veganism? Because if you look at the comments, yes, there are plenty of people that thought Alex was very likable and kind, so he seems to have succeeded on that front. But what about with respect to veganism? If I'm being totally honest, guys, when I tried to watch the debate from the perspective of a Michaela Peterson fan, yeah, Alex seemed very appealing. But veganism did not seem appealing at all. In fact, it came across as completely unviable health-wise. And this is because of how many times Michaela claimed that veganism isn't healthy and that meat is a necessity for health. So here lies my main problems with Alex's performance on the podcast. While coming across as more tolerable and passive could maybe make Alex seem more palatable to Michaela's audience, there are other ways which divert slightly from operating purely passively that Alex could have, and in my opinion, should have pursued given the things Michaela was saying during this podcast. Plus her channel being filled with instances of her bashing the nutritional adequacy of veganism, which we all know her audience is very well accustomed to. Assuming Alex did what he did to make veganism seem more appealing, he could have at the very least pushed back on her claims such as the vegan diet long-term doesn't work, meat is a necessity for health, or that veganism is bad for children when it comes to brain development. Because let's be totally honest, guys, where exactly is the value in Alex coming across as nicer and more agreeable in an attempt to make veganism more appealing when Michaela is, at the same time, claiming that veganism is not healthy long-term? This is obviously akin to making veganism not look appealing. I just don't see much value in veganism looking more appealing because of Alex's agreeableness and lack of pushback when it's in the face of Michaela Peterson making veganism look inherently nutritionally deficient and hence unappealing. Alex could have made veganism look much more appealing by just refuting, if not just questioning, Michaela's claims, which are making veganism look so unappealing. And I'm not saying that Alex needed to be insanely aggressive or go hyper debate mode to push back either. It is possible to not be passive and push back on what she was saying without coming across as super aggressive. For example, he could have just asked for straight evidence for her claims. Asking for evidence doesn't always have to be a very aggressive thing, and doing so would have helped illustrate how Mikhaila Peterson has no idea what she's talking about when it comes to vegan nutrition and is just making random, baseless claims that lack sufficient evidence. With all that being said, this is why I don't totally agree with all the comments defending Alex's passive approach in his conversation with Mikhaila. There was a time and place to be more passive and agreeable to sway certain audiences about certain topics, but in the case of discussing veganism, I don't think that this is at a time where your interlocutor, Mikhaila in this case, is making veganism look entirely unappealing and saying over and over that vegan diets are missing key nutrients and that you will become unhealthy long term if you consume one. And this applies especially to veganism, given online how often we hear myths like this about veganism being like, long-term deficient or, a nutrient deficient diet, etc. So again, guys, this part of the video is not really dedicated to Alex. It's more so dedicated to the people that are defending his, passive approach on Mikhaila's podcast. To Alex, I don't know what his intentions were when not pushing back on her nutrition claims. He could have genuinely not had many things to say given a lack of knowledge on some of the strongest scientific literature supporting the consumption of a vegan diet. I'm not really sure. But even in lacking this knowledge, Alex at the very least could have just asked for evidence. All right, so now that that's out of the way, let's go over what I would call my problems with Alex's moral system and concept of ethical veganism.
I guess I'm a bit more relaxed than most vegans, and I don't even like using the word vegan because people are sometimes upset with exactly how I use the word, how I define it, or the situations in which I think it would be permissible to eat animal products. A lot of people have told me that it's potentially misleading. Really, I just have a commitment to minimizing animal suffering. So coming at this from an ethics perspective more than a practical one, I quite simply just grant the conditional, right? If it is the case that this is going to minimize suffering, then that's the right thing to do. So if it turns out, let's say, that sort of hunting is actually a better way to procure our nutritional requirements, because of course we could eat plants, but plant production, plant agriculture requires killing animals too, and it's possible that in some circumstances hunting an animal might kill less animals and it might actually be less painful for that animal. Like, I don't know about the practicalities of that. I don't know, but I'm just willing to just grant easily that if it is actually the case that involves less animal suffering, then that is the thing to do. Now, most people define veganism, at least the Vegan Society defines it, as a minimization or an exclusion to the highest extent practicable of all forms of animal exploitation. I like to use the word animal suffering there, and it means it's got a slightly strange implication, which is that if veganism is just excluding animal suffering to the highest extent practicable, then even if you are killing an animal for food, if you're doing it in such a way that genuinely minimizes to the highest extent practicable all forms of animal suffering or exploitation, then it's not just that you're permissibly breaking veganism or something. Like you're doing the vegan thing according to the ethical definition.
All right, so in this clip, it seems that Alex operates from a utilitarian perspective and the Vegan Society's definition for veganism. And this definition of veganism seems to be what leads him to the conclusion that if hunting an animal causes less death than, say, buying plant food, which we know causes some amount of crop death, then hunting that animal is technically the vegan thing to do. So a couple issues here. Let's start with discussing Alex's moral system, and then I'll go on to discussing what my problems are with the Vegan Society's definition for veganism. So I do not take a utilitarian view that if an action is going to result in less suffering and death and more utility than another action, or say just not committing the first action, that doing the first action is morally permissible. Here's an example of that. I don't think it is ethical to go and murder a person with optimal organ function if it means that 5 people currently on the way to organ failure will end up living. I also don't think that it is more ethical to go ahead and murder a random 300-pound human for food over buying plant food, because doing so would result in less suffering than would occur in a crop field. To me, it is just not always the case that when given multiple choices, that I should make the choice that leads to the least amount of suffering and death. In the case of killing a random person for their organs to save 5 other people, and killing the 300-pound human over buying crops, I would say that both of these instances of killing qualify as a rights violation, and the utility gained from killing the innocent person would not be such that killing the innocent person becomes morally permissible. For those who don't know, my moral system tends to be one more so captured by threshold deontology rather than utilitarianism. So essentially, if you were to scale up the utility gain from an action that I normally take issues with as a rights violation, my attitude may change. For example, if somehow killing one person saved 1 trillion people, I would not have an issue killing them. So that's point number one about Alex's moral system. He seems to be operating from a utilitarian perspective, whereas I do not. Assuming Alex is a pure utilitarian, this would mean that Alex takes the view that raising cows to have net positive lives and killing them prematurely for meat would be morally permissible. This is something he claimed to be, quote, sympathetic to in my last video, although when he says sympathetic, I don't know that he means he agrees with doing such a thing. Here's another extension of Alex's view that I don't agree with. On Alex's view, he would have to accept it as ethical to raise humans who are given net positive lives and kill them for human flesh. Unless, of course, he can name the trait or set of traits present in animals such that it is ethical to raise and kill cows on the net positive happy farms and not humans. Again, I don't really know how far Alex's utilitarian views go. I don't know if he's a negative utilitarian, but if they do go as far as I'm speculating here, Alex may have to accept happy human farms and happy cow farms as morally permissible, which I'm sure many vegans listening into it is absurd, not vegan, and just wrong. But when we look at the definition of veganism Alex seems to be operating from, or the Vegan Society's definition, assuming that supporting happy human and cow farms generated less suffering and more utility than buying plant foods, these things would technically be the vegan thing to do, even if the murder of these animals or humans may qualify as rights violations. So let's cover what my issues are with the Vegan Society's definition of veganism. The definition reads, veganism is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude as far as is possible and practicable all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. So here lie my issues with the Vegan Society's definition of veganism. The part of the definition that reads, as far as is possible and practicable, is very ambiguous and nebulous language. What exactly does this mean? Does this mean that because it is technically possible and practicable to not exceed daily needed calories per day to survive, that consuming an excess of calories derived from plants is not considered vegan because doing so is not excluding animal suffering and death, specifically from crop deaths, as much as is possible and practicable? Are vegan bodybuilders eating in a calorie surplus and hence causing more crop deaths than they otherwise would have caused had they consumed their base needed amount of calories, not vegan because they are not excluding animal suffering and death as far as is possible and practicable? But then some may say that it isn't really practicable to pay attention to your calories this closely. So vegans in these scenarios are still technically vegan. But what does that mean? I know for me, I can totally tend to this standard. So maybe it's more or less practicable for certain people, or people who are able to practically watch their calories this closely, not vegan for over-consuming calories, but the people who are not practically able to count their calories as much, still vegan despite over-consuming calories. What about outside of excess calorie consumption? What about deciding to hunt an animal for food over another action which causes more death? If somebody goes ahead and hunts an animal for food and it excludes animal suffering and death more so than buying plant foods, is it now considered vegan or more vegan to hunt an animal over buying plant food, since hunting an animal, in this case, excluded animal suffering and death as far as is possible and practicable? These are some of the problems that you run into when operating under the Vegan Society's definition. The Vegan Society's definition really only cares about minimizing suffering. It doesn't really take into account things like, animal rights violations. And of course, the whole possible and practicable part is very vague and leads to other weird absurdities like you not being vegan for over-consuming calories because you're technically not excluding animal suffering insofar as is possible and practicable for you. Aside from the possible and practicable problem, one of the main problems I have with it is that there is no talk of the nature of killing and whether or not the killing qualifies as a rights violation. What if killing a couple animals who are destroying your crops and property result in more death than hunting and eating a singular animal who is not doing anything to you? Is hunting and killing the singular animal the more vegan and ethical thing to do in this case because it excludes animal suffering as far as is possible and practicable? Or does the nature of the killing matter and we view killing in defense of crops to not be rights violations, whereas hunting an animal who is doing nothing to you is a rights violation? You guys may think I'm being pedantic here, but these are the routes you have to go down when operating under this definition and using phrases like as far as is possible and practicable, or only caring about animal suffering and not rights violations. What if somebody is addicted to a certain food, so they claim it isn't practicable for me to stop eating steak? Is their consumption of steak now vegan? What if somebody just finishes a giant vegan meal and has no access to vegan food for 12 hours, but gets very hungry at 10 hours of waiting? Are they justified in going to a steakhouse because in their view, it wasn't practicable for them to wait another 2 hours? Here's another thing that follows from the definition, which Alex even agreed with. If somebody needs to, quote, eat meat in the way that Michaela Peterson says she needs to given her allergies to other plant food, she would technically be vegan in deciding to eat meat because doing so was in the bounds of what is most possible and practicable. Now, what is considered morally right and technically vegan, according to the Vegan Society definition for veganism, are two different things. I'm not sure if Alex thinks that if an action is considered vegan by the Vegan Society's definition, it is therefore right. I intuit that he would think this as long as the action maximizes utility and reduces suffering. given his utilitarian values. Here's an example. If I had a biological need for animal products, say in the form of needing a pig valve to save myself from dying, it would technically be vegan for me under the Vegan Society definition to kill a pig for their valve, since doing so would be me acting in what is as far as is possible and practicable for me. And assuming these valves are bought from a happy pig farm, meaning that this, farm generated a net positive amount of utility in the world, Alex would consider buying these pig valves right. If the farms I purchased were from factory farms and therefore cause a net increase in suffering, my decision to have a pig raised and killed would technically be vegan under the Vegan Society definition, but not right according to Alex. I must ask though, if purchasing a pig valve out of need from a happy farm is right according to Alex, would he also consider it right to kill a human for their valve out of need from a happy farm that was raising humans with a happy life to be murdered for their valves? Would killing animals and humans in these scenarios for their valves be technically morally right according to Alex? Oh, and to be clear, in case you're wondering, I do have a video on whether killing animals out of need is moral. In short, I generally don't think it is, but I'm of course understanding of why somebody in a survival situation who is starving and delusional would do whatever they can to survive. It would be hard to consider a person morally culpable in that situation, but that doesn't mean I think the action of killing out of need would be right. Back to Alex though. Here is a recap of my problems with Alex's concept of ethical veganism and his moral system. And at the end, I'm going to talk about one last thing, which is a problem for Alex when it comes to human rights, given what he might believe in about animal rights and killing animals out of need. His utilitarian views seem to entail that he would have no issue with net positive happy cow farms, and by extension, net positive happy human farms, which, at least in the cow case, conflicts directly with the vegan fight to rid animals of their commodity and property status from humans. He seems to define veganism under the Vegan Society's definition, which comes with a lot of confusion derived from the phrase as far as is possible and practicable, leading to a lot of odd scenarios in which a person technically may not be considered vegan for overconsuming plant calories, which cause needless crop death, when they could have practiced otherwise, meaning they are not excluding animal suffering and death as far as is possible and practicable. The definition also would consider hunting animals for food to be vegan in a scenario where doing so excluded animal death more than buying plant foods, not taking into account any concept of animal rights violations or the nature of the killing in question, and instead only which decision resulted in the least amount of suffering. This definition also considers killing pigs raised in factory farms for pig valves as vegan in the case that you are somebody who needs it and can't get these pig valves from like a happy free-range pig valve farm or whatever you want to call it. The definition doesn't consider that the killing of the pig, though it's a need for you, may still be a rights violation and therefore wrong. And Alex's moral system would consider it ethical to raise pigs and possibly humans on happy farms to kill for humans who need valves. So clearly operating under the Vegan Society's definition for veganism puts you in a quite odd place as an animal rights advocate, given everything gone over in this video. But here's one final point for Alex about his moral system and human rights, not animal rights. If Alex considers killing pigs for their valves out of need technically vegan, but morally right in the case that these valves are extracted from a happy pig farm that generates a net positive existence, does this also mean that Alex does not have a moral issue with humans being farmed on happy human farms for their valves? Imagine these humans are bred, are given a net positive existence, but have their net positive existence prematurely taken from them because other humans need their valves. I don't know what Alex would say, but his moral system does seem to point toward approving this. I certainly wouldn't, given that I see the killing of those humans as a rights violation. Put simply, I don't just care about doing what maximizes utility. I would love to talk to Alex about this so I don't have to keep speculating as to what his positions are on these things. So Alex, if you see this video, we can talk privately. It can be recorded. It doesn't really matter. I would just like to have some clarity on your positions, and maybe it could be public because I'm sure other people would also want to gain some clarity here. All right, guys, that is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you support my work and want to support me on Patreon, you can get early access to my videos by clicking the link in the pinned comment. And if you don't know, I do have an ebook going over all, if not most, of the anti-vegan arguments you're going to hear online and how to debunk them. So if you want to purchase that, that'll also be linked in the pinned comment. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Leave your comments, be civil, let's have, a conversation, and I'll see you in the next video.
Dude.
Fuck off, I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
Even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who is your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude.